Hey folks, welcome back. It's Crazy Welder, and in today's video I'm going to show you guys how to install an Accelero Xtreme IV VGA cooler on this XFX double dissipation R9 390X. And the reason for this is because recently I've been having some issues with the card overheating and throttling down, and so as a result I would end up getting some very low frame rates or just stutter in general. And so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right into this. Basically, the tools you're going to need, obviously your graphics card, you're going to need the cooler, and just a Phillips head screwdriver with a small tip, some Arctic cooler type thermal paste, and some gloves. I like to use the gloves because they ultimately help kind of prevent any static from going to the card. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to start by opening up the cooler first and showing you guys the stuff that's inside, and then we're going to move on and take the graphics card apart. Okay, so we got a couple things here. We got what looks like something that holds one of the plates and possibly a part of the cooler. Okay, so it's got a couple of different tabs here that are holding this thing in place. Got a couple more things here, but before I move on to that box, I just figured I'd show you guys the size difference here. So, you know, obviously, side by side, you have the card and you have the other cooler. And the double dissipation cooler is pretty nice, but as you can actually see in terms of the heatsink size, this is actually a larger heatsink, and it's not entirely obvious, and it's probably not going to be entirely obvious until we take the other one off, but basically the thickness of the two heat sinks is ultimately what sets them apart. The stock one is probably about 3/4 the size of this one, and it's also not nearly as long. So as you can see, where the stock heatsink ends at about where these copper pipes start, this one kind of keeps going. So that's the difference there for you guys just right away in terms of the size. And ultimately, you know, because this sits a little bit higher away from the card, you end up having a little bit more of the cooling effect from the fans as well. They're going to be drawing a lot more cool air into the system. So let's see. We've got this guy, which is going to be something you cut out for the backplate to keep the backplate from touching the metal components. So it's kind of important. I'm going to set that aside. We've got a bunch of different pads here and stuff like that, and screws as well. And then finally we get to the actual fun part, which is this rear heatsink. And, you know, obviously this one's going to be much bigger than just the stock pad that comes, the stock backplate that comes with your card. You know, the difference is pretty staggering, whereas the stock pad is just this guy right here. You have this thing, which obviously takes up a lot more space, cools the card down a lot better, and just keeps temperatures down in general. Okay, so that's basically everything taken apart. Next, let's try and get into how we're going to do the card itself. Okay, so now comes the fun part of disassembling the backplate and also the heatsink for the stock card. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start. There are a number of screws here that sort of hold the backplate in place, and so we're going to have to go ahead and take those apart. Also, as you can see, there are these little tiny kind of stickers on the screws that are basically saying if you remove this, you void your warranty, which, you know, is pretty obvious given what we're going to be doing to the card. And there are a couple of other screws that are sitting around here that we're going to take off. And I'm basically going to fast forward through this part because it's pretty simple. You guys should be able to do this on your own, and that'll take the backplate off the card and ultimately also help us remove the stock heatsink and fans as well. So at this point you have this little tab that you need to carefully remove, which is the stock fan header. You want to be quite careful removing this so that you don't damage it, just in case. And so just like that, after the 4 screws are removed, you have your heatsink now gone. And this is where the thermal paste is going to come in handy, because we're going to need to replace the stuff that used to be here with the stuff that was on the card. Now, the nice thing to notice here is that there are quite a few copper pads being used on the stock heatsink, which is nice. Compared to this one, there aren't quite as many pads going, but they're going in different directions, and ultimately the copper pads in the replacement are going to be a lot thicker. And again, you can just easily see the size difference between the two coolers, and ultimately also the thickness of the two, and that makes a big difference in terms of cooling performance overall. Now, the stock heatsink did come with some thermal paste, but there's also some on this one. Now, technically this could be enough, but I'm just going to add just a little bit more, probably like a dab of my own, which is Arctic Silver, and that's just because I like to do it that way. The Arctic Silver is kind of a nicer overall kind of cooling thermal paste, or a thermal element, I should say. So now let's go ahead and take these screws out. I'm just going to kind of go ahead and shake these off. Let's see if I got all of them here. So you want to be kind of careful, because these screws, they have this little spring on them. I don't know if you guys can see this, hopefully you can, but there's a little spring on the screw, and you want to make sure you don't lose that, because it's going to be kind of important. And I'm doing this in a really haphazard way, because I'm really lacking on time as per usual, but you want to make sure you keep kind of all of those together and in their own space as much as you can. Now, my card already comes with a number of sort of fins and heat sinks everywhere, so that's nice. And I also have this pad here that already sort of cools some of the memory chips that the card has as well. But ultimately, we're going to be removing this back plate here and putting on the heatsink, and also we'll see if I end up removing this piece or if I end up keeping it on. I might be able to keep it on, as it's a nice little piece right here, and it'll actually be cooled down more by the fans that come with this particular cooler as well. I'll see if I end up having to replace any of these heat sinks here, but this card is a non-reference card, so with that said, I think these might do the job okay compared to what I had before. The one thing you want to keep track of is if your card has stacked power connectors, because if you do, basically it's not going to fit with this cooler. So the result is, you want to basically get something else if you do have stacked power connectors. And that's something I should have mentioned earlier, but I didn't until I read the manual. So something to keep in mind is that ultimately, if you do have stacked power connectors, you're kind of out of luck on this cooler. Again, pretty long card, but I'm actually surprised to see that the cooler is not going to be that much longer. And another point to make here is that when you do this, you will want to make sure that your card still fits in your computer case. I know for me it's going to be quite tight, so it's going to be a very difficult fit in the case that I have, which is an Antec 1900, I believe, that I've got. So that's something to just keep an eye on, be careful with stuff like that. But let's go ahead and remove some of these other screws at this point and see what we can get going here. So let's see, this does not look like it's a screw, so it should be fairly straightforward removing this piece. And as you can see, the back plate is actually partially held in by this plate right here, as well as a couple of these screws on the actual main board over here as well. So that'll take probably a little bit of time to remove, but ultimately it should not be too bad, I don't think. So let's go ahead and see if we can get this guy off. And it looks like at this point, this is the last screw that we're going to have to take off to remove the back plate off of the card. And certainly looks like it's letting go, but there's one more screw right here next to the R15. So let's go ahead and get rid of that one as well. This one looks like it's going to be a long one as well. Oh, nope, actually still a shorty. But that was that. So the back plate just comes right off. Real easy, actually. I was not expecting it to be quite this easy. But here it is. As you can see, this one also has that plastic film covering the back of it so that it does not make any sort of contacts with the all these little metal parts back here. And the interesting thing is that on this card, it actually does not look like there's too much stuff to cool on the back here. Some of the cards, you know, ultimately, they'll have some of that stuff on the back as well that needs even more cooling, but with this one, it doesn't look like it's quite going to be the case. Okay, so at this next point, what we're going to end up doing is you're going to take one of these, and actually, well, there's 4 of them, out of your box, and you're going to go ahead and disassemble this little part right here for where the GPU ultimately sits. And then what you want to do is you want to make sure to see exactly where it is that these mounting holes that you're going to use will end up being. So the way that you do that is you take this guy and you take your card and you sort of just align these 2 pieces, and ultimately the easiest way to do this is to just put this one down and hope that you have enough light and sort of put this over it and see which mounting holes you're going to end up using to align the heatsink and also the card itself. And so in my case, I'm seeing which ones they are, and from the looks of it, I'm going to go ahead and insert this guy in here so that I can sort of see where it's supposed to go. See if I can do this the right way without getting too much of it to touch ultimately. Okay, so it's one of those right there, so that's not gonna work. And it's just kind of trial and error, you know, until you get all the holes to line up, and then this ultimately tells you which one you're going to end up using. So you just kind of flip the card over, lift this thing a little bit away, and so as it looks like I know which hole I'm going to be using. So for the double dissipation card, you're going to end up using one of these guys right here, and that'll ultimately get you where you need to go. And it looks like one of my heat sinks here came off, but that's okay because ultimately they'll end up getting screwed back on, so that's not really the issue for the time being. So what we're going to need to do next here is we're going to need to take a look and see ultimately which way we're going to want to mount this. I think that this is going to be the way it's going to go. This is going to stick out quite a bit past the edge of the card there, so I wonder if I can just probably leave this the way it is right now, as it's still connected to this piece pretty good. So I'll end up leaving it as it is, I think, because these are actually glued on pretty tight, and I'll let you guys know if that affects anything. I don't think it really should. I was hoping that I would just be able to kind of use this guy and screw them back in, but I guess the back plate is ultimately what they screw back into. So I guess the next part we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and put some of the pad material onto the card, and these pads are ultimately what's going to prevent the back plate from sticking to the bottom here and ultimately touching parts that are not supposed to be touched. And it looks like we only get one of those guys right there. So I guess it's just this pad in the center where the GPU is supposed to be. So no big deal on that front there. And again, you want to align this guy as much as you can before ultimately proceeding forward. And then these guys, the way that they end up going in is this bottom part ends up going in here, and it's going to end up kind of just going in like so. So I'm going to put these in and I'll show you guys what it looks like once I've got them screwed in a little bit better than I currently do. That just gets installed right there. And the next thing you want to do is you want to find some washers, and there's a couple that actually end up going in here. And there's a couple of different ones. So there's a white washer, and there's a transparent washer that ends up going onto this thing. So let's see if I can find the transparent ones in here. I don't even know what it is that they mean by transparent, because these all look pretty gosh darn similar to me. But let's see. Okay, so it looks like the difference is this. You have one of these guys, which looks like this, and hopefully you guys can tell. And there's one of these little, smaller white guys that you'll put on there. So it would be my assumption that you get this guy on there first, and then that guy goes on just like that. So overall, this seems to make sense. Ultimately, this is kind of an odd way of mounting things. I've never seen it done this way in particular, but you know, whatever. It's what they tell you to do, so just keep getting those washers until you've got everything in place. There's a lot of tiny parts that you end up having to use for this. It's kind of a pain. I wish I'd actually just dumped all of it out so I could do it the right way, but let's see. Okay, so we got the washers on the card now, and so this is the part where ultimately the foam block ends up going onto the back again, you know, for the God knows what time that I've done this at this point. And actually, I'm thinking that this part should, for the most part, be okay. What I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to end up getting some alcohol and just wiping off the old thermal paste on the GPU, and you want to do that all the time, be it GPU, CPU, just for the sake of getting the old crummy and sort of stiff stuff off of there and using the new thermal paste. Alright guys, so rubbing alcohol is not a must, but it certainly does help, and I've just got it on a paper towel here. I'm going to take that pad off and just sort of rub this along to see if I can get this stuff off. Just clean your stuff up, clean it up as best as you can, get all of it off the components as much as humanly possible, and then get a dry paper towel and go over it again one more time just to make sure that you've gotten all of this stuff off. Ideally, you would have some Q-tips for doing this stuff. I don't, so that's my own fault. But if you have Q-tips lying around at your house, that would definitely be the way to go, as opposed to the way I'm doing it, which is with a paper towel. So you just want to make sure it's shiny enough so that you can see like your own reflection in the GPU itself. And once you've done that, basically what we're going to do next is basically we're just gonna put this guy on here. You want to make sure you get your orientation correct. That's the one like important piece about this essentially. Once you've got that done, basically put this on, and then we're gonna end up using a couple of the other hardware pieces here to hold this guy all together. So just make sure that you've got everything aligned the right way, and I'm doing a pretty shitty job right now. Let's see. Okay. So just like this, and we're going to get this guy aligned this way, and it looks like, based off what I'm seeing here, it looks a little bit off. And I don't know if that's due to one of the washers getting in the way or something like that. Those problems. So ultimately, you want to make sure that your posts right here are as far down as they can possibly be. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. Okay, so I ended up putting everything back into place as it was supposed to be, and it still does not seem to be really contacting the GPU as well as it should. So that's kind of interesting, and it ultimately kind of makes me wonder if I need to take one of these washers off. So I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. So as it turns out, I'm actually having these guys right here basically getting in the way of me being able to put the cooler on. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to actually take these guys off after all, and we'll see if there are supplied components that can actually cool this down for me. So that's going to be it's going to be kind of interesting. Those guys are going to have to go.